Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar with the Stanford Biodesign Innovation Fellowship Alumni. We're so glad that you could join us this afternoon from wherever you are in the world. As you're hopping on, we would love it if you would just answer our quick poll that appears on your screen. There are just two questions, and it will really help us understand how you heard about this webinar and the fellowship in general. So if you could just fill those out, it would take you about 2 seconds. That would be great. We are lucky to have 4 fantastic fellowship alums with us today to talk about their experience in the fellowship and their career paths before and after the program. We're joined by Janine Furch, Vic McRae, Shreya Mehta, and Rush Bartlett here, and they'll introduce themselves in just a second. During the webinar today, we'll have the option to submit live Q&As. So please type your questions in using the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar down at the bottom of your screen. And we will get to as many of those as we can throughout the hour. This webinar will also be recorded and posted on our website if you would like to go back or share it or anything like that. So with that, I'm so happy to introduce our alums and hope you enjoy the webinar.
Shreya, do you want to start with an intro?
Sure. Do we lose Emily? I'm Rush Bartlett. I was a Biodesign Fellow in 2012, 2013. Went on to start 2.5 companies out of Biodesign. That's an interesting story in itself. And then worked in startup field for about 6 or 7 years, and then am now Vice President of Innovation at Lansino Laboratories, a global women's health and breastfeeding company.
Hi, we'll try that one again. That's better. I was sitting next to Emily. So I'm Janine Furch. I was a fellow in 2016, 2017. I'm a neonatologist. So it was right after my fellowship training and pediatrics residency and neonatology fellowship. I am a neonatologist at Stanford. And so I do a lot of research as an academic neonatologist, but also started a company out of biodesign. And then I teach at Biodesign right now. I teach one of the faculty fellows courses and some of the grad coursework as well.
And I'm Shreya Mehta. I was a fellow in 2013, 2014, and sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was a fellow in 2013 and 2014. I am a biomedical engineer by training, and I worked at a couple of different companies, including St. Jude Medical, and have a little bit of engineering experience on a number of different kinds of products. And then I actually worked at FDA for about 4 years, and I was a lead reviewer at FDA working on cardiovascular devices. And then after the fellowship program, decided to start a company out of the program called ZenFlow, working on a product for men who have enlarged prostate, benign prostatic hyperplasia, who suffer from that symptom. And we are in the clinical trial phase and about to start our US pivotal study.
Hello, my name is Vic McRae. I completed the Biodesign Fellowship in 2011. I'm a general and trauma surgeon by training. And currently I practice part-time and am CEO of a startup company that was a spin out from the Biodesign Fellowship in the ophthalmic space.
So Vic, why don't we start with you? How did you decide to apply to the fellowship?
I became interested in medical devices during my general surgery residency as I began to interact more with devices and realize the impact that those devices had on the outcomes from my surgeries and also the methods of ways that I delivered care to patients. And also at the same time begin to have my own ideas for products that I thought would benefit patients. But realized that I didn't know how to go about realizing any of those ideas. And when I heard about the Biodesign Fellowship, I thought it was a great way to learn a process to take ideas and move them all the way to products that end up, directly affecting patient care. And that was the reason I decided to do the fellowship.
I'll go next as the other MD. I had a very similar experience, although I'm in a field where there is very little neonatal devices or medical devices in the field, and there's a lot of jury rigging that we do. So it felt like we were always working around to try to get things to work for us, mostly because medical devices are generally made for adults and then made smaller for kids. And that frequently doesn't work in a neonatal population when you're dealing with 24-weekers or people who are very, very different sizes and have different pathophysiologies than adults. And I really started to realize that my research was headed in this direction, and I would answer really interesting research questions, develop technology, and then I didn't know how to translate it. And it would end in a research paper, which was great, but it just really wasn't enough for me, and I wanted to have a much larger impact. So that's what initially drew me to biodesign.
I can go next. I decided to apply to the fellowship when I was at FDA, and with my experiences as a lead reviewer, while those were incredibly helpful to understand the regulatory process, I wanted to kind of flex my engineering muscles a little bit more once again, and also, get a more holistic view on healthcare in general and understand better how products can successfully come to market and benefit the patients. And so I decided to apply to the fellowship program at that point, and without necessarily the ambition of being an entrepreneur. And it was by virtue of the need that we saw and what we thought were really important insights to solve those needs. Decided to apply to the program, and ultimately ended up starting a company. But I don't think necessarily you need that ambition to get into the program or to benefit from the program.
And I applied to the program because when I was in an undergraduate degree program in chemical engineering, biomedical engineering really wasn't a thing at the time, at least where I was going to school. I knew that I needed some sort of degree in biomedical engineering to sort of be a real biomedical engineer. And I was looking around on the web and just happened to stumble into seeing the Biodesign Fellowship. And I said, wow, I don't have to go to class. I don't have to do exams. They pay you. This is amazing. And then I clicked on some of the resumes of people that were in the fellowship. I think Vic was one of them. Michael Ackerman was one of them. And I said, this is insane. I'll never get into this program. Slept on it and said, okay, well, I'm going to grad school. And so went to grad school, did that experience, all really because I was passionate about learning how to do medical technology translation and innovation from a sort of sketch on a napkin to product realization standpoint. And I can say there's been no better education than what was provided over such a short time at Stanford, and would definitely recommend anybody considering it to go.
Great. One of the next questions we wanted to ask, and maybe Shreya, I'll start with you. What were the highlights of your fellowship experience?
For me, as an engineer, by far the biggest highlight was being in a hospital setting. So for those who may not know, there's a part of the program where you get to experience firsthand what the physicians and healthcare providers' needs are, in addition to patients, of course. And so you go into observation mode at hospitals and clinics, and you get to observe procedures in the operating room, et cetera. And even though I had worked on medical technology before, I hadn't got a lot of exposure to how products are actually used in the clinic, how medical technology is used, and kind of the flow of medical care in general. And all of that was an incredible learning experience. And that was by far the biggest highlight for me.
For me, the biggest highlight was definitely along the same lines as Shreya, the clinical immersion. From an engineering perspective, you just cannot get this kind of access in any other field or program or even in a job. Several companies that I work with try to do ethnography research, and all of that is great, but we were able to show up, on the night shift, on the weekends, kind of off hours, and really just have unfettered access to any kind of procedure or thing we would want to see. And that type of empathy building from an engineer, learning what the physicians go through, I think has really made me a better innovator.
To piggyback on that, as a physician, I thought that the clinical immersion part of the program was also very interesting, because I think in the day-to-day of taking care of patients, it's very easy to not take a step back and think about what's going on and identify problems as problems, because they're things that we see and have to deal with every day, and we become used to the way that things are done. So having the opportunity to take a step back and observe the clinical setting as a true bystander and identifying problems that I have no doubt I would not have identified if I were actually treating the patient, I thought was very eye-opening from a physician standpoint. And on top of that, being able to take those ideas and problems that we identified and work them through the entire process and learn, what all of the devices that we use on a daily basis have to go through in order to actually make it into patient care was really eye-opening.
I definitely have a similar experience. I think it really allowed me to develop a different way of thinking. And truly that's a bit untangible, but it was truly how to think outside of the box, how to think in a completely different way than you start to be trained in medical school. So when you go to medical school, residency, and fellowship, it's sort of, this is the way that it's done, this is the evidence behind it, this is what we do. And there's not a lot of room to think outside of the box. So that was wonderful, to be really incorporated with engineers and to be able to help explain what the problems really were and actually dig into medical problems more than I ever would have as a clinician, and just really, really start to understand them. And then even just to develop a framework. I really love teaching the process, and that has been a major impact on my career, and being able to mentor different companies and advise them on how to potentially get their technology to patient care. But one of the biggest things I think of the fellowship was really getting the network and exploring the network that you're exposed to. It's not just the network within Stanford, but the network within all of Silicon Valley and amazing med tech entrepreneurs. We have CEO coaches that are CEOs of major corporations that we meet with every other week to talk about our ideas, and you would never have that kind of unfettered access. We can talk more about this, about the people that are engaged in the program, but they are serial entrepreneurs. They're people who are extremely experienced and have been extremely successful and dedicate their time to us. And I felt extremely privileged to be exposed to that in ways that I never would have if I had just stayed in academic medicine and had not done the fellowship. So the next question we have on the list was, what was the biggest challenge of the fellowship year? Rush, do you want to start that one?
I think the biggest challenge of the fellowship year is that there's just not enough time. I mean, it's you're there for such a short amount of time, and there's a ton of pressure to make use of this really, golden year essentially, or golden, 8 months, 10 months, depending on how you look at the externship. That you leave there wanting more. And I think that the encouraging thing about that I've noticed is that even when you get out of the fellowship, it still in a lot of ways continues. I mean, the fact that we're on this webinar talking to you is, volunteering our time at all the graduation events. There's, 100 alumni that show up every year to graduation. So it's almost 50%. And people live all over the world. So it's a really special family. And that I think is just predicated by being in this really enriched environment where there's a quality process behind it.
I would agree, Rush. I think, one of the challenges that our team faced throughout the year was having to make decisions in order to move forward in the process without always having, what we felt was enough information to make those decisions. And we had to learn how to become comfortable with that process and kind of trust the process, that if we work through it, that what we would end up with in the end were really, rich ideas that can meet the needs that we identified during clinical immersion. So that was something that we had to learn, and one of the big challenges. I think one of the other really big challenges that we had to learn was how to work on a team of 4 very type A people with no hierarchy, and how to really leverage the diverse experience on the team in order to come up with the most rich products and projects by the end. So that took a lot of working through and interpersonal dynamics in order for us to really begin to work seamlessly as a team.
For me, I think it was a lot more of what you said, Vic, to start, and a lot of it is related to the fact that healthcare in general is multifaceted and has a number of stakeholders involved, and that's an optimization problem that's really, really difficult to get right. And so you find a clinical need, certainly. And as an engineer, sometimes you can find solutions pretty readily to a clinical need, but how does it work for the payers? How does it work for reimbursement? How does it work in terms of regulatory? And aligning all of those stars just right to have a successful product is something that takes a lot of work and a lot of optimization. And for us, it was really identifying something that we had that would really meet those requirements if we wanted to move forward with it. And I think that was our biggest challenge as we started to narrow in on what we really wanted to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because we talk so much about identifying the need. And I thought as a physician, I knew there were tons of needs and I thought they were all pretty good. And then I went through this process and I realized there were so many different ways that they're needs, but maybe they're not worth spending the next 10 years and several $1 million or hundreds of millions of dollars on to solve, or that they wouldn't be successful and they wouldn't actually make it to patient care, which would be a wasted energy. So I really felt like the entire time we spend on identifying needs and truly understanding the stakeholders, the cycle of care, what potential business obstacles you may run into, developing IP, etc. All of that was extremely helpful in starting to understand that all needs are not created equal. And then I would always echo that the biggest challenge for us was teamwork. We were on a team with 2 physicians and 2 engineers, and all type A people who really wanted to do what was best and succeed, and sometimes that's challenging. Biodesign does a great job of having a team coach that you meet with every other week to really help sort of navigate that process. But I think it was an extreme growing opportunity, especially as a physician who's expected to lead teams, but not necessarily be on an equal playing field without hierarchy, since medicine is so hierarchical, to learn how to do that and to learn how to take that back to the clinic or to my ICU, and to be an even more effective physician in daily practice too. We're getting a lot of great questions, so I would encourage you to keep coming with the questions because we're going to get to them in just a minute. But my next question, maybe starting with Vic, what were your career aspirations before biodesign, and how did they change after graduation?
They changed almost 180 degrees. Before biodesign, my plan was always, full-time medical or surgical practice. I was planning to do another surgical fellowship after residency. And once I completed biodesign, then I realized that I wanted to be a medical device entrepreneur as well. And now I split my time between surgical practice and, being CEO of our startup company. So really big change of trajectory that would not have been possible and would not have even been on my radar if it wasn't for biodesign.
In terms of my career, I'd say it's maybe not changed 180, but at least the goals at which you think you can reach increase significantly. And my aspirations change from being, I just want to be a biomedical engineer in a big company and kind of work until I die, to, I sort of understood that there's a process and there's a way to really create something from nothing. And that's a real empowering thing, because you can create your own destiny. You can do sort of whatever you want at that point, with some, big limitations about family and how to make a salary if you're an entrepreneur, and all those dynamics. But it was really liberating to come out of that, because then I said, okay, I can just graduate and not have a paycheck. And, I know, not just based on faith, but based on empirical data and a lot of work, that there's something here that a lot of really smart people around Stanford have said is interesting. And that was very liberating.
Yeah, for me, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I didn't have entrepreneurial career ambitions, certainly, and I thought that I actually had a similar thought to Rush, where hopefully not work till I die, but work work at a larger company, contribute my engineering prowess to some bigger bigger corporation, and it was really the both the need. The clinical need that we identified, the solution that we had, and the fact that the solution that we had a lot of interest from physicians, from patients, that allowed me to pursue it, or encouraged me to pursue it as a company. And I think the other thing is that there. It was always a risk, but I think one of the things people have touched on before is the environment that the biodesign program is in. At Stanford, you have a lot of really experienced, knowledgeable clinicians and advisors, and you have this network of people that become available to you by virtue of the fellowship program, that really is very empowering, and it makes you feel like, even that you can try this, that you have the right resources available, you can tap into that network to try and help you along the way, and then even beyond that, you meet a lot of people who, to be quite frank, have tried and have also failed, and so you start to see that there's little downside to trying and giving things a shot, and so with that encouragement is why we decided to start Zenflow. And I think that it's both a virtue of the training that you get, as well as the network that's in front of you.
Yeah, those are all awesome answers. I never thought that I would do biodesign until probably 2 years before I did. I was on a different research trajectory to be an academic neonatologist, and doing research around simulation and data displays, etc. And it really changed the way my career trajectory went. While I'm still an academic neonatologist, I get to teach the biodesign process, which is amazing. And it's so much fun to help start to build a pediatric infrastructure. I'm now involved in a pediatric device consortium. So really trying to spur pediatric innovation from an academic standpoint, because it's very difficult to get a lot of investment in pediatric companies for a lot of reasons outside of an academic facility. And then just being able to be in the ecosystem and be around it, it really has just changed my way of thinking and what I really wanted to do with my life. So it has dramatically changed the direction that I have gone. We have a bunch of great questions. Some of them are around timing, so I thought we should just address that from both of our perspectives. So there's a lot of questions about when is the best time to do this? Like, should we do this while I'm still in a PhD program or MD training, or a few years out? What's the right level of experience to have?
So I guess I can start with one opinion, because I think it varies. It's not a perfect answer, at least from what I've seen. But at least within the fellowship, you know, if your goal is to come in and get a good education, or if your goal is to come in and get a good, you know, get a startup company out of this, neither of those two things may actually be the end output. Some people that come in hell-bent on, you know, getting a startup end up graduating without a startup. And some people that come in, you know, thinking that, oh, there's no way I would want to be an entrepreneur. I'm just here to get a good education or take an easy research year. They end up with a really compelling idea, and they look around and say, wow, you know, I would be crazy for not pursuing this and going forward. So, you know, with both of those two outcomes in mind, I think that, you know, the only people I've seen that have sort of regretted from a timing perspective of the fellowship are people that have to go back to training, or people that are sort of in the middle of something. If you come at the transition point, like either you graduated from your PhD, or you're in your last year of your fellowship, or your last year of your residency, and this is just the last research thing you need to do, that gives you a lot more flexibility to extend your time doing biodesign-like things or doing a company. And I feel like that's probably the best time. If you're in industry, the earlier you can get here, I think the better for your career. But PhD or MD, my advice would be wait until you're finishing some sort of transition.
I can weigh in on the MD side. We've had fellows who were in the middle of their residency. We've had fellows who had just completed residency, and we've had fellows who have been out of residency and in practice for a while. To my knowledge, we've never had anyone who had completed their medical school training but didn't have any years of residency experience, but I could be wrong there.
I think we have had one.
We have, okay.
Yeah, just one.
So my opinion would be, so I think that there is some value to having some residency years behind you and more experience working in direct patient care in a hospital setting, just from an understanding of the flow of care in our healthcare system. I think there's some value there. I think there's also value in, as an MD, killing two birds with one stone, because a lot of our fellows who are in the middle of residency use the biodesign program as required research years through their residency program. And because medical training is so long, that could be a really good way to satisfy both the research requirements and also get, you know, phenomenal training in biodesign. With that being said, I completely agree with Rush. I did the program at the end of my residency, and that gave me a lot more flexibility in what opportunities I took advantage of after biodesign, because I did not have to go back and complete more years of my residency. So it was a great way to you know, continue on into my career trajectory without having to go back. I don't think there is a right answer. I think it just depends on, you know, your personal preference. I think it also would have been challenging to be out practicing as a full-time surgeon, making a full-time surgeon salary, and then stopping that and going back and becoming a fellow at the fellowship salary. So I think it was the right timing for me, but I think that's going to be, you know, a very individual decision.
I completely agree with Vic. I'm wondering if Rush or Shreya can comment a little bit more about work experience, because we have another question talking about how many years of work experience. Would you recommend to her in order to be as prepared as possible?
I think probably 4 or 5 years of work experience, just enough to understand the ecosystem and how things kind of come together. You know, for me, that wasn't at a big company, that was at FDA, that I think I really had the meat of my industry experience. And I know we've accepted fellows who have less than that, and some who have had more than that. But to me, that seems like a nice kind of sweet spot, because it's before you've really kind of truly crafted the direction of your career, but you have enough under your belt to understand how things work.
And I would say from like an age perspective as a surrogate, I don't know of anyone who's been younger than 25 in the fellowship. There's been a lot of people much older than that, but usually the average is around 30. I think this year was actually a little older than 30. But don't take that with oh, I'm never going to get into the biodesign fellowship, because, again, we've taken people who are 25, we've taken people who are 35, we've taken people, older than that. But that's generally the sweet spot in terms of years of experience relative to future potential boost with doing the fellowship, and the opportunity cost of leaving a good paying job, as Vic mentioned.
Yeah. One of the questions is, how competitive is the program, and what is the acceptance ratio? I think we usually get somewhere around, and correct me if I'm wrong, 120, 160 applications. Is that about right? And then they usually invite somewhere around 30 people for an in-person interview in the fall. And then you're accepted sometime around November, December, around the holidays. And they accept 12 fellows a year. And that's a mix of usually physicians and engineers, people in business. But this isn't just for physicians and bioengineers, as is one of the questions asked, that this could be for anyone with, medical experience, business experience, engineering, technical experience. And I'll let you guys expand on that a little bit. But it is hospital based. So if you're talking about dentistry or veterinary medicine and things like that, realize this is a hospital / medical based fellowship largely, or at least that's the way that it's currently designed. Not that you couldn't explore in other locations.
I think I remember from the webinar that I attended many years ago, just like this one, where Todd Brenton, who was one of our past fellowship directors, was speaking about how chemical engineers should not apply to the program. And as a chemical engineer on the other side of the fence, I was like, well, I'm going to show him differently. It ended up okay, because eventually when we got to interviews, what they described is they really look for 4 different types of people on the team. Your educational experience is one thing, but it's more about who you are at your core. Are you a builder, somebody that gets their hands dirty and makes things? And that could be a physician, it could be an engineer. I mean, we like to think engineers usually are like that, but not always. Are you somebody that has deep sort of academic or technical expertise, usually a PhD, but not always? Somebody that's got good clinical experience, and someone who can organize and run a team. That's usually a business person. So we think of it in those 4 different sort of functional categories. Sometimes you have people who are engineer physicians. Sometimes you have people who are business engineer or business physician. If you've got 2 of those 4 skills, great. That only helps, but generally those 4 skills are key.
And to put that into context, Rush, the company that we spun out of Biodesign is a chemical engineering project.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other questions that talks about diversity of projects is, what kind of projects really come out of the program? And is it mostly focused on devices, or do you also focus on processes and digital health solutions and things along those lines? I'll address part of this question. We actually started a women's health company that involves hardware and software and has a huge digital component. Most of the companies that have come out in the last couple of years have some sort of digital component, whether they're entirely digital or not. But all of the medical devices have something associated with that. So that's a part of the program that they're certainly building up, and there are plenty of resources in the Valley to start to learn about that and to connect with entrepreneurs in that area as well.
And Biodesign also has faculty members that help to spearhead the digital health side of the program as well.
So when we came out of the fellowship, we had, as I mentioned, 2.5 projects. The sort of 1.5 were pure medical device projects. One being a drug delivery device, and one being just basically a plastic widget that connects to a breast pump. And then the main project that came out of the fellowship, the one that I ran for 6 years before moving on to my current opportunity. That project was a pure software company, complete medical records platform for end-of-life care. So again, chemical engineer running a software company, what the heck is that about? The reason that happened was because the biodesign process drives you towards the best unmet need, best defined as, biggest value, most severe patient population, biggest impact you can make for your time. And that just happened to be it. And we trusted the process and ended up running into another fellow who had the CS expertise and formed a company around that. And it's been very successful.
Thanks, Suresh. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about your externship period and what it is? I had to go back to clinical care during that time because I was an attending physician, so I didn't get to do one, but that is not generally the case in academia. I get to do an externship.
I think in general, the program encourages fellows to go a little bit either going out of your comfort zone or kind of giving a test trial to something you might want to consider after the program. And I actually ended up working for a company in Ireland who was trying to hash out their regulatory process. And for me, that was a little bit of a litmus test for whether I wanted to get into regulatory work, having worked at FDA before. And while it was an enjoyable experience and it was fun being in Ireland for a month, ultimately made me realize, and then of course having the compelling need that we had made me realize I didn't really want to pursue that. I think the program, tends to, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong about this in recent classes, but tends to discourage people from just working on their biodesign project, and encouraging you to leave the Stanford doors for a little bit and figure out something else.
Yeah, I think externship is a good opportunity to do a couple different things depending on your choice. One could be to get experience in something that you might never get experience in again. So we've had fellows that did their externship at the FDA, for example, because they wanted to learn more about the regulatory process and they had no desire to ever go and work at the FDA, but they chose to use that 1 month to learn that sort of, get that sort of experience. The other option is to do an externship in an area that you might be interested in after the fellowship to either confirm that interest or to actually open some doors. If you do an externship at a company, for example, that you may be interested in working in, that's a good opportunity to get to know the company, have the company get to know you, with the goal being to potentially go and work for the company afterward. I personally, at the time of externship, was contemplating working at a startup after biodesign. So I went to work at a midterm, kind of mid-stage startup, but doing mostly clinical trial work. And I learned that I really liked the startup environment, but I hated just doing the medical part of a startup company. So that was a really enlightening, month for me personally.
And then my externship, sort of early on in the fellowship, I had come in with this idea that it was sort of going to be one project. The old adage of, just focus on one thing. For whatever reason, that sort of just didn't stick with me. I like to sort of be a little schizophrenic and do more than one thing, which is not always well advised, but I've survived. And so to that end, I really wanted to learn how folks who do that kind of thing for their career are successful, and immediately gravitated towards the incubators that are in the Valley. Again, to Janine's point, like there's access that you'll have through Biodesign's network that is not accessible to general people. I was fortunate enough to get an externship at Foresight Lab, which is an ocular drug delivery incubator. I think they've started about 7 companies now. 5 of them have been acquired. I mean, just really top-notch people learning, through the process of what a startup's like, but also being there, in the kitchen of the little startup incubator to ask about questions of how do you think about projects and, structuring companies, to do it in a, incubator model. And there's 4 or 5 groups like that around the Valley. that have been extremely successful. And to me, that was appealing, never to sort of go from start to the end of a company to IPO, but to really start a company and get it stable, to let the next sort of group of managers come in and do that. And that was a really rewarding kind of experience for, again, just a month of time that you have to invest.
That's good. I'm jealous of all your experiences there.
Yeah.
And I mean, some of my teammates, they all went international. They went to France. They went all over, worked for VCs. There's plenty of things you can do. But just to clarify what an externship is, if it's not clear to everybody, it's a month-long externship away from biodesign, where you don't have responsibilities at biodesign, where you can travel other places and do other things that are potentially outside of the process, but still of interest to you. And usually it's at the end of the year, where you're starting to think about whether you're going to take that project forward or not. We have a couple questions that talk about how do we make our application stand out, or what type of candidate is are the biodesign selection committee looking for?
So I'm not on the review committee this year, but I was on the review committee for a couple of years in the past. And the thing that I noticed in reviewing applications were the people that skimped on the video. I mean, the video from a score percentage is pretty low, actually, but it's indicative of the level of effort and time and personality of the person. And I found that the applications that had a high quality video, that there was some thought put into it, not from like a professional editing perspective, but just, the message behind it. And it wasn't just sort of, 5 minutes before the application was due. The rest of those applications that had those high quality videos were also high quality. And that's just what I've noticed.
Yeah, I think there are a number of qualities that I think the program has determined makes for a really good fellow. And those are the qualities that we try to determine through the application and interview process. I think, as Russ stated, it's a very busy year. So hardworking individuals tend to do much better in the fellowship, and those who go the extra mile and take the extra effort. But also, fellows that demonstrate their creativity, their teamwork and willingness to collaborate with others, which is just a core tenet of this program. Those that are stellar and outstanding in their field of specialty, I think is another area that we really look for in applications. And those who are open-minded and also are dedicated to really making a difference for patients, I think is kind of the common underlying of everyone, no matter what their background is. We really want people who, no matter what they end up doing after the fellowship, want to make an impact on patient care in the end.
Yeah, I think one of the things that tends to stand out is Vic mentioned this, just the teamwork quality. And I think especially in the in-person interviews, if you're to get to that stage, there's in-between interview activities and things like that where the current fellows and some of the faculty certainly are paying attention to, how well you work with others or how you converse with others. And I think a part of this is personality as well. And just, the program tries to match you with teammates who they think you're going to be most productive with. And so there's that sort of ineffable quality as well that I think, comes through your personality during the in-person interview. And I think at the end of the day, it's a little bit cliche, but you have to kind of be yourself. And I think at the end of the day, if it's a good fit, then it is. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And I certainly know people also who have applied one year, didn't get in, and applied the next year and got in. And it's not necessarily because of what they did within that year, but partly because maybe it wasn't a good match with potential teammates during that year.
Definitely. I would just add, we're also really looking for people who have this overwhelming sense of curiosity. So a lot of these things are really, they're just not tangible. But to be enthusiastic and dedicated, to show that you've had follow through with different activities that you've done or projects that you've worked on, and an overwhelming curiosity and tenacity. Some of these questions, let me see here. We've got a couple questions about what do people end up doing after. I'll generalize this one. What do people end up doing after the program? And I think that varies for all of us. Certainly there are a large portion of physicians that go back to clinical work. Some of this is because they happen to be in the middle of their training, so they have to go back to clinical work whether they wanted to or not. Recently, in the last couple of years, a lot of the physicians have been finished with their training, and those individuals have either started innovation programs within their academic institutions that they go on to work with, like my colleague did. I stayed obviously in an academic environment, but that is not necessarily typical. Some people go into private practice and or do locum work where they just work part-time, and then they're able to do more company work as well. Some people end up doing consulting from if they're a physician and still working as a physician, and some people leave entirely and run programs, or they leave their training program entirely. So it really depends on the individual and what kind of need they've come up with and team they've built. I can tell you, I had no intention necessarily of starting a company, and I got pretty close to almost leaving medicine and fully joining the company. And I'm grateful to continue to be involved in it and to have a crazy balance of all the things that I do. But I wouldn't have necessarily expected the outcome going into the fellowship necessarily. It changed my thinking that much.
I think at least recently there's been an uptick in sort of a bridge to a startup by using consulting. So Biodesign has a lot of corporate sponsors of the program, all the major medical technology companies. Biodesign is something that we teach, not just at Stanford, but also at the corporate level. I've trained over 700 people in the last few years at Becton Dickinson and Johnson & Johnson, Edwards, a lot of different groups. And this is something that people across the medical technology industry are adopting for their front-end technology innovation process. But because there's not a lot of expertise yet, there has been an increasing opening for sort of program management support for biodesign fellows who have just graduated from the program and some alums. And that's been seen as sort of a ground to sort of practice if you want to work for a larger company, but also to bridge yourself financially in a very expensive area like the Bay Area into a startup or into a different type of career move. But people have gone to VC rarely. People have gone. One person was a lawyer that came into the program. She's now running her own patent firm. There's the traditional companies. There's consulting. It's pretty much everything and anything you could think of. Your imagination is the only limit.
Anything else to add? There's a question that talks a little bit about the interview process and wondering what that's like. I'm going to try to answer some of these in typed format online too, if we're not going to get to them, because I know we only have about 10 minutes left. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about the interview process? Because it's certainly unique and a fun experience.
Sure, I'm just going to try and type some answers to some of these other questions. Shreya, do you want to field this one?
Sure. Yeah. So I alluded to the in-person interview a little bit, but I'll back up a step and talk about the application process in general. So there are multiple elements to the application itself, and one of them, as Rush talked about earlier, is a video that you submit, and I think that is a good opportunity to make yourself stand out a little bit. In addition to things that are probably usual when applying to a program like this: recommendation letters, grades, your exam scores, etc. One thing that as someone who has been on the committee before as well, there is a lot of interest in not just the video, but recommendation letters. That's one of the things that gives us a little bit of insight into who you are as a teammate, how well you collaborate, how well you work with people. And as I mentioned earlier, that's definitely an important characteristic to have to be successful and learn the most from the program. And then the in-person interview process, as Janine mentioned, is narrowed down to about 30 people. And one of there are a lot of activities that go on. You learn things about the program, and then you interview with different faculty members. There's actually a brainstorming session with one of the interviewers, and that's actually pretty fun because you just get to be in front of a whiteboard. You're introduced to a clinical problem, and then you get in front of a whiteboard and you're going for quantity over quality, which is pretty fun. And then in between interviews, as I mentioned, there's some activities actually with the current fellows. And so you do we had our year we had an egg drop test, and so we went into the collab where there's a lot of prototyping materials, and you get into groups and try to design your own egg drop contraption, so that if you drop an egg from 3 stories, does it break? And so there are fun activities like that interspersed with the interview process. So in general, it's actually a pretty fun day.
Agreed. Yeah, for physicians, it's definitely different than anything you've ever done or any interview you've ever been a part of, and it was eye-opening, and it was really fantastic. There's one question here that talks about, like, if you're interested in a certain device, do you think a specific fellowship's necessary, etc. And I just wanted to clarify one thing. So they do pick a topic, a clinical area to focus on every year, and you don't know what that is until you get here. And most of the teams, there's an exception to this, but most of the teams start their immersion in that clinical area. And all it's really intended to do is to say, okay, this is an area you can observe. You have a little bit of clinical background on that. People know that you're going to be there and you're open to that. That doesn't limit you to that area by any means. And you can arrange observations within the entire hospital. My year, we actually had aging and longevity. And so we went to different nursing homes, patients' homes, other facilities in addition to hospital viewing. And I can tell you, none of the devices that came out had a direct correlation to what we had done. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they're very much affiliated with that. But this isn't a program that you come in with your idea of the device and then the team builds it for you. There's sometimes that misconception. It really is learning the process and figuring out a whole host of needs, usually over 200, letting them compete with one another and figuring out which is the best need to take forward regardless of the clinical area that it's potentially in. So I hope that clarifies some of the concerns. Do you guys want to add anything to that?
So I came into the fellowship and had a startup company on the side and it was sort of floundering. And I thought, well, I'll put that need into the biodesign filtering process and see sort of what comes out. And it ended up being sort of in the middle of our needs list of 200 needs. So it was need like 78 out of 200. Very validating that what I was working on was not important enough to be worth our time. And so, just to echo what Janine said, it's not about coming in with a project. If it's best if you come in with a complete blank slate and just a very open mind in terms of what you could be doing, because you never know what you're going to find.
Quickly answering some of these, are recommendation letters a form, or do they have to actually write a letter? They actually have to write a letter, and so we read them. So if they want to get started on that, that would be fine, but it's an actual letter that they will send in. I like this question, so I think this question we could potentially use. Oh, and I also wanted to say there's some of the questions are focusing on, do you have to be really experienced or do you have to be really inexperienced to be a part of this fellowship? And it really runs the gamut. We've had people that are VPs of med tech companies come through, and we've had people that have are still in residency as MDs or have a couple years of work experience in an undergrad degree. So it kind of depends on you as the individual and where it's appropriate for your career, but some experience is definitely helpful. The one question is, if you could do anything different during your biodesign experience, if you had the chance to do it all over again, what would that be? So that we could end on that one.
I just submitted my my written response to that, so I'll let others go.
For me, nothing. It was great.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I can't think of anything specifically that I would do differently. I thought it was great as well. I I definitely got everything and more that I wanted out of it when I started.
And I laughed because I said I'd have to agree too, even though it took a course in various parts that I wouldn't necessarily have expected. And we ended up with an amazing women's health company that I'm really proud of. I wouldn't have changed anything that we did, although there were lots of bumps along the way and lots of uncertainty. But a couple years later, I would say the same thing. It was an amazing experience from the highs and lows and everything in between.
Does everyone get to see the written answers?
I think they can with the Q&A.
Okay, all right. Well, I just wanted to, yeah, I mean, the only thing that I mentioned was as an engineer, just taking more advantage of the engineering resources on campus in hindsight. But at the end of the day, it was, you know, like others have mentioned, it's a very short time period and there's a lot to do. And prototyping certainly kind of came last and was toward the end. But it maybe, you know, in hindsight, I would have prototyped more imperfect designs earlier in the process instead of waiting for hashing out a better design and prototyping later. Just to take advantage of all those resources on campus.
Now that we have a couple minutes left, Vic, I just wanted to ask you this question. So what differentiates this program from all the others? So there's some that people have mentioned in the US, and then of course others, you know, in Ireland and Biodesign affiliated or not.
Yeah, there are a number of programs, as Janine stated, and many of them are actually based on the biodesign philosophy and the biodesign textbook even. What I will say, there are a few unique things about Stanford Biodesign that is really hard to replicate, and that's the ecosystem we have here in Silicon Valley and the sheer number of experts in so many different areas of medical innovation that we have direct access to that help to enrich our fellowship year. That is something that's really hard to replicate in some regions and also in some countries. So while a lot of those programs are really good programs and really solid programs and definitely help to spur innovation in those regions, I think, you know, Stanford Biodesign has a secret sauce that I have not seen replicated successfully anywhere.
And I would just add 2 quick points on that too. One is the corporate access and the corporate education. All the major medtech companies are coming to Stanford for a week in March to get their executive education training and all the on-site training. There is a little bit of that that's done with a couple of the other programs, but nothing on the same scale. And the reason is because the Biodesign textbook is great, but this process is not a finished product. It's continually improving every year that we go through, and not just training fellows, but training classes of graduate students and undergraduates and industry representatives. And it's improved every single year. So there's a little bit new about the process that's sort of not in the textbook that will always be in the cutting edge of the Stanford program that will then disseminate to the other programs who are usually affiliates of ours over the years.
Thank you guys. Emily, do you want to wrap up?
Yep, we are out of time. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists for joining us and for sharing their experiences and advice, and hope you found it really valuable as you move forward in your application process. Just a quick reminder, applications are due Thursday, August 15th. That means all letters of recommendation, all transcripts, all parts of your application are due that day. So if anything comes in after that date, we won't accept it. So make sure you have everything in. Check with your recommenders, make sure they've gotten your request. Make sure you've got everything ready to go on August 15th. And this will be posted on our website, the recording of this webinar, if you'd like to go back and watch it again. And please reach out if you have any questions about the process or that we didn't get to today. And thank you so much for joining us again. Good luck, and we look forward to receiving your application. See you later.